Bill Watson here. Hope you're enjoying these podcasted Bible studies that we've arranged to conduct. You know, the Church of God International has always intended to try to utilize as much of the technology that we have and different methods and tactics that it provides to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ. And podcasting is really a very valid and legitimate method in utilizing the technologies that are at our disposal. However, podcasting does have its limitations, as you well know. Unlike webcasting, you can't really interact in real time. So what we've done, we've made arrangements whereby you can ask questions or make comments and send them to us via email. That's right, all you've got to do is go ahead and email us at billw@cgi.org, and hopefully this is going to enhance the educational value of the subject that we're covering as we go through the topics in a more specific way, being directed by your questions and your comments. So let's go ahead now, prepare to go back into the book that we're studying, and we'll look forward to your comments and questions. Just email us. Remember, email us at billw@cgi.org. And welcome again to this, and those of you on the internet who will be watching this later on, welcome as well to this chapter 5 of Daniel. As many of you know, we had left off finishing up with Daniel 4. That's what comes before Daniel 5. And that was a very interesting chapter that now gives us a bit of time lapse here with the year being somewhere in the vicinity of about actually around 539 BC, which was a step down from the year about 564 when we left Nebuchadnezzar, who had the experience of being essentially devolved to an animal as he went ahead and spent all that time as 7 years there as an animal. And now we come up here, chapter 5, with Belshazzar. The king made a great feast. This is Belshazzar, the king of Babylon at the time. But now let me stop myself before we get started here, just to give you some backdrop on a little bit of just who Belshazzar is. Many will claim that he is, and some scholars recognize this, that he was not actually the son of Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar, there's a case to be made, was actually his grandfather. And the Hebrew word that is used here is essentially one that is used for anything that's relative to family, that is relative to a association of an individual that would be basically associated with your family. Belshazzar, most scholars recognize, was the son of Nabonidus. And Nabonidus was essentially the husband of Nitocris, who was the daughter of Nebuchadnezzar. And Nitocris and Nabonidus, who were married, had the son Belshazzar. And it was actually Nabonidus who was the king of Babylon. Belshazzar, his son, was actually in essence a crowned prince, and for all intents and purposes was actually running Babylon, because as was pointed out in the Cyrus cylinders, as well as the Nabonidus Chronicles, and even the Dead Sea Scrolls point out that Nabonidus disappeared. He disappeared for about 10 years and literally delegated or deferred the rulership of Babylon to Belshazzar, his son, for quite a few years, for those 10 years, I should say, that Nabonidus, had disappeared. Now, there's a lot of what you could say theories as to why Nabonidus disappeared. Some claim he got into hot water with the priests of Babylon because he was a follower of the moon god Sin, as opposed to the god of the Babylonians known as Marduk. And Marduk was the one that was the more popular god that the priests recognized as the god of Babylon. And Belshazzar was pretty much a follower of his mother's religion, which was the moon god Sin. her name again, his mother, Nitocris, and she was the daughter, as most scholars recognize through these sources that I mentioned, the Cyrus Cylinder especially, of the king Nebuchadnezzar. Now, she had a brother. Nebuchadnezzar had a son also. His name was Amel-Marduk. Amel-Marduk was actually king of Babylon before Nabonidus became king, but only for a short period of time. It was that brother of Nitocris that ruled Babylon for a little bit of a while, but then there was a coup that took him out, and consequently it was defaulted to Nabonidus and Belshazzar, his son. According to the Dead Sea Scrolls, in particular to the Dead Sea Scrolls called the Prayer of Nabonidus, it discloses the fact that he, Nabonidus, stayed in a city called Tameh for about 10 years or so. And as I said, the theories are he got in hot water with the priests over this fact that he would not concede to conducting, which the king was supposed to do, to conduct these holiday services in honor of Marduk, the god of Babylon, as opposed to his belief with regard to the moon god's sin. Also, that there was some suspicion or speculation that he was sick, physically sick, and he was in Tameh taking care of his health. Others have claimed that he was searching for the meaning of life and just got out of it. He was tired of it all and just wanted to get out of the spotlight. And then there's even some scholars who claim that Nabonidus was actually, and I don't believe this because Daniel had actual interaction with Nebuchadnezzar, but that some scholars believe Nabonidus was in fact the one who actually had the 7 years of being the animal that Nebuchadnezzar, we're told in chapter 4 there, that he, Nebuchadnezzar, was the one who was brought down to the animal level, and for 7 years basically scrounged around with the bovine animals. And I think that's more likely because of the fact that Daniel had actual interaction with Nebuchadnezzar, and the fact of Daniel 4 being what it is. I don't buy that Nabonidus was in fact the guy that was indeed the one that was described there in chapter 4. But at any rate, we pick up here in Babylon, in chapter 5, about Babylon, and this now brings us, chapter 5 brings us from, as I said, about 564 to now around 539. This was the year that most scholars recognize that Babylon officially fell to the Medes and the Persians. The Medes and the Persians were the ones that came next under the leadership of Darius and Cyrus. And I want you right here at the outset to recognize something, because you're going to see in chapter 6 some what might appear to you as an incongruity, because we understand Cyrus the Persian, that's the key, Cyrus the Persian was the one, for all intents and purposes, that freed the Jews out of captivity, out of the 70-year captivity, and they went back to their land. Whereas Darius the Mede, the Medes and the Persians, it was a combined kingdom, it was a combined empire, and Darius was indeed a leader in that Mede-Persian empire, and most will attribute, as you will see in chapter 6, when we come upon the ending here of chapter 5, that it was actually Darius the Mede, not Cyrus the Persian, that took the city Babylon down that night, and actually was, in fact, the killers of Belshazzar, the son of Nabonidus. But at any rate, we'll get to that as we proceed here. Point being, Belshazzar now is going to throw a big party. Now, you have to understand, Belshazzar was insolent. This guy, I don't know how young he was. I was trying to find out about how old he was, because he was the son of Nabonidus, who disappeared for 10 years and was actually considered, Nabonidus was actually considered the king of Babylon. But Belshazzar, still being considered a king because he was ruling, and was ruling alongside his father and taking care of Babylon while his dad disappeared. The fact is still, and remains to be stated, that nevertheless he still was a very, very egocentric, egotistical snot. I mean, he was just a real insolent kind of a guy. He thought, he was pretty tough stuff, pretty big stuff. And that's why I tend to think he was probably kind of young and too much was given to him too soon, and all those kinds of things that go along with sometimes young people getting too much. We see a lot of that in athletics today with football players and baseball and basketball players who are basically fresh out of college, in some cases out of high school even, and making multi-million dollars, thinking that they're much more powerful than what they really are. But Belshazzar was a bold-faced, brazen, brassy, and bodacious kind of a guy. He just really was impudent and, as I say, a real egocentric. And here, in these first 4 verses, you're going to see how egocentric, insolent, and basically bald-faced he was, even to God. Here he says, we're writing here in reading, that is, in chapter 5, verse 1, Belshazzar, the king, made a great feast to 1,000 of his lords, 1,000 people, drank wine before 1,000 people. Belshazzar, while he tasted the wine, commanded to bring the golden and silver, this was fingers in God's eyes. You talk about disrespect. He took the very booty that Nebuchadnezzar, his father-in-law, basically, who was Nebuchadnezzar was a father-in-law of Nabonidus, but his grandfather, you'll see, basically was Belshazzar's grandfather. He took all that booty that Nebuchadnezzar had taken out of the temple, which was in Jerusalem, this is verse 2, and the king and his princes and his wives and concubines, that they might drink there. So they had concubines, they had wives, they had prostitutes. It was just a big freelance orgy, drinking, drunken, eating kind of a thing. And that's the way, they were celebrating this. And he brought out the vessels so that they could drink their wine and out of the goblets right from the very temple of God that was in Jerusalem, that was raised by Nebuchadnezzar when he invaded Judah. Verse 3, they then brought the golden vessels and were taken out of the temple and the house of God, which was at Jerusalem. And the king and his princes, his wives, concubines, they all drank in them. They drank wine, praised the gods of gold, which essentially were their gods of Babylon and so on, and silver and brass, of iron, of wood, and stone. So this party is going on. Get the picture. This party is going on. I mean, they are just really living it up. They're drinking, they're eating, they're doing all kinds of probably, risque things that are happening in some of the pictures that you see in the arts depicting many of these drunken orgies that many of the Romans and or Babylonians participated in their time. And in that hour, out of the blue, oh man, this really gets spooky. Verse 5, in the same hour came forth fingers of a man's hand, not a woman's, a man's hand, and wrote over against the candlestick where there was light. So the wall that was chosen to do this writing was lit purposely with a candle. That's where it was chosen to be written. And the candlestick upon the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. The king saw the part of the hand that wrote. There's a very iconic painting of allegedly Belshazzar, in a turban and so forth. It's a very popular painting. You can see it on the internet if you type in Belshazzar painting. I think you'll be able to bring it up where he's looking at it and he's just like in shock. I mean, he is startled, he's stunned, he's taken back. He doesn't know what to make out of what he's looking at. And verse 6 describes his change of countenance, because here in verse 6, the king's countenance was changed. His thoughts troubled him, and his joints. Now, this is interesting because you don't really get the picture of this, but it's interesting to note, in my case here in my middle margin, I have, under the word joints, I have his girdles. In other words, it gives you the picture that he was wrapped in a girdle of sort, with ties. And they came, the knots, it says in my middle margin here, the knots of and or the bindings of this girdle came undone. I don't know whether God did that or whether he was so scared that he was breathing so fast or whatever. But he got to the point where it says here in verse 6, and his knees smote one against the other. So he was in an uncontrollable spasm of his knees knocking and his girdle unraveling. And he was just really bothered by what he was seeing because this was such a supernatural event that he was witnessing. And the king, and in my middle margin, says, with a mighty voice, he cried out, he yelled, he said, to bring the astrologers and the Chaldeans and the soothsayers, verse 7. And the king spoke and said to the wise men of Babylon, whosoever shall read this writing and show me the interpretation thereof shall be clothed with scarlet and have a chain of gold about his neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. Now that's interesting, the third ruler. And this goes back to the fact that Belshazzar was number 2. And his father, Nabonidus, was number 1. Why wouldn't he give the number 2 spot? Well, he was number 2, so he had to give it number 3. And that's where a lot of the scholars in studying this and claiming that Belshazzar was the son of Nabonidus, the father-in-law of Nebuchadnezzar, and then that would make Belshazzar the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar. We see here the fact that he was given the position of third ruler, or these people would be given the third ruler role if indeed they could answer to Belshazzar what in the world was going on with his hand. Then came in the king's wise men, verse 8. They could not read the writing, nor make known to the king the interpretation thereof. And the king Belshazzar, in this case here, was very bothered by this. He says in verse 9, then the king Belshazzar was greatly troubled, and his countenance was changed in him, and his lords were astonished, because he was really bothered. Now, we find next that happens because of this event, and this is all happening in this night. This is all happening at this party. This is all happening in this one, as they say, evening that was going on here. And in verse 10 we see now the queen enters into the story in verse 10. And by reason of the words of the king and his lords came into the banquet house. She heard all the commotion apparently and became alerted to what was going on, or that something was going on. And the queen spoke, O king, live forever. Now, most will admit this was not his wife. This was not his wife. This, as you will see here, goes on to portray that this particular queen had some currency, memory, was apparently alive when certain things that Daniel was involved with, she was aware of. Belshazzar, there's no indication Belshazzar was even aware of Daniel. As a matter of fact, indications, according to many scholars and of some of the outside information that portrayed Daniel, it claimed that Daniel was pretty much out of commission at this time and was kind of being brought back in to the flow of things here in the latter part of his life. And obviously we know too, because as we're getting closer here to the end of the release of the 50,000 or so Jews back to their homeland in Judah, Daniel was already an old man at that time. And we know that Cyrus is going to come on the scene here at some point and release the Jews from their captivity of Babylon. So we're down many years into that captivity at 539 BC. So in this case here, though, she says, the queen spoke, going back to verse 10, about halfway through, and the queen spoke and said, O king, live forever. Let not your thoughts trouble you, nor let your countenance be changed, because he was really frightened. He was scared out of his wits. He didn't know what was going on or what to make of what was going on. He says, there is a man in thy kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. And in the days of your father, now in my middle margin here, when it says in the days of your father, I've got grandfather. I don't know whether or not you do or not, but I do have grandfather as an illustration of showing that this Hebrew word is indeed a word that can be construed as a family-associated word, somebody in a legacy of the family line. It says here, "And in the days of thy grandfather, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, was found in him, whom the king Nebuchadnezzar, your father," or grandfather, the king, "I say, your father made master of the magicians and astrologers, Chaldeans and soothsayers." So she, in talking here about Daniel, is certainly illustrative of the fact that Daniel was an unknown factor or an unknown entity to Belshazzar for all intents and purposes, because she's introducing him by reputation to Belshazzar, that he, Belshazzar, should go ahead and seek him out and find out what he's doing and whether or not he would be available. Verse 12 now. "For as much as an excellent spirit and knowledge, understanding, interpreting of dreams, and showing of hard sentences, and dissolving of doubts were found in the same Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar." Belteshazzar, this is not Belshazzar. Belteshazzar, and I'll need to perhaps go back and maybe in chapter 6 find out the meaning of that. But Belshazzar means the Baal protects the king. Belshazzar, the king of Babylon, means Baal protects the king. Belteshazzar, at this point I'm not quite sure just exactly what that means, but I will have that at a later date. But now let Daniel be called, and he will show the interpretation. So Belteshazzar, as we know, was Daniel's Babylonian name, and for all intents and purposes here, the king Belshazzar is now being asked to find Daniel. So in verse 13, Daniel, though mentioned by reputation, now is brought before the king. This is major now. So out of somewhere Daniel was, he gets tapped and tagged. The king's men go and find him, and they said, "Hey, Belshazzar wants to talk to you. The queen has introduced your reputation to him, and it's time for you to go and see the king." So Daniel was brought before the king. The king spoke, and he said unto Daniel, "Are you that Daniel, which are of the children of the Jews of Judah, the captivity of Judah? Are you that guy, whom the king, my father or grandfather, brought out of Jewry?" So he didn't recognize him, obviously. He doesn't know who Daniel is, so he's asking for confirmation. "You're Daniel? Are you this guy that this queen had mentioned to me about you? I have even heard of you, that the spirit of the gods is in you, that light, understanding, excellent wisdom is found in you. And now the wise men, the astrologers, well, they've brought you before me, that they should read this writing, and make known unto me the interpretation thereof. But they cannot show the interpretations of the thing. And I have heard of you that you can make interpretations and dissolve doubt." I mean, he's laying this on Daniel. He's laying it on thick. And I mean, Daniel, you could just imagine standing before the king of Babylon, or at least the functioning king of Babylon in this case, not Nebuchadnezzar, his dad, but certainly the operational king at the time of Babylon, because Nebuchadnezzar, remember, he's in Tameh, the city of Tameh, for, like I said, about 10 years. Although, a little bit more of the backstory, apparently there was a lot of activity, noise, information coming to Nebuchadnezzar, who was in Tameh, and it's around this time that Nebuchadnezzar does indeed come back after about a 10-year hiatus from Babylon. He starts coming back to intervene on the attack and invasion of the Medes and the Persians into Babylon. As you will see, that was going on in parallel behind the scenes at this time. However, in all due respect, Nebuchadnezzar never was able to conquer those Medes and Persians. They were able to just kind of cut right through him, as history has shown, and they ended up, as I said, continuing on to Babylon that night to go ahead and take this out, take Babylon out. But at any rate, the discussion continues on, and he says in verse 16, as I reiterate, "And I have heard of you that you can make interpretations and dissolve doubts." So he says, "Now, if you can read the writing, because the writing is on the wall. There's the candle, the writing is on the wall. So it's there. I want you to read that and tell me, what does that mean? Wow, you talk about pressure. You know, he can't make this up. You know, you're in the spotlight here. And the king is asking and putting you on the spot. And he says, you shall be clothed, if you can, you shall be clothed with scarlet, and you'll have a chain of gold around your neck, and you shall, interesting, be given the third ruler of the kingdom. It's a third position again. He's consistent with this third position. So he's going to give Daniel the third position. Now I want to stop there for a minute. Let's go back. Let's just go back and remind ourselves here. Remember chapter 2. After Daniel was able to interpret the dream of the image, Daniel 2, go back to Daniel 2 for a moment. Keep your finger in Daniel 5. But I want you to kind of draw a contrast here, or at least make the connection of why Daniel is about to say what he's about to say. Because in all due respect to what Daniel had been given by Nebuchadnezzar, when in fact Daniel interpreted that dream back in chapter 2 of the image of head of gold and so on, this third position that Belshazzar is offering is obviously not something that Daniel really even cares about, especially after you realize and go back and remind ourselves of what he had been given here with Nebuchadnezzar, who was the king. I mean, Nebuchadnezzar was the equivalent of Nabonidus, okay? Belshazzar, remember, was just a crown prince operating at the behest of Nabonidus, while Nabonidus was on that hiatus in Tame for 10 years, because Nabonidus was really the king of Babylon. But in this case, you've got Nebuchadnezzar, who is the king of Babylon in chapter 2 at the time. And in verse 47, the king answers unto Daniel and says, of a truth it is. This is after he interpreted the vision, the dream of Nebuchadnezzar, that your God, with a capital G, is a God of gods and a Lord of kings and a revealer of secrets, seeing you could reveal this secret. The king was impressed. Nebuchadnezzar was really taken by Daniel's ability to interpret the dream. Verse 48, chapter 2, Daniel 2, verse 48. Then the king made Daniel a great man. The king made Daniel a great man. This goes back, way back now, into the 560s, 570s. Remember, we're in 539 in chapter 5. We're in 539. This goes back many years before when Nebuchadnezzar was indeed alive and Daniel interpreted that dream. And we read here, the king made Daniel a great man, verse 48, chapter 2, and gave him many great gifts, made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon, and chief of the governors over all the wise men of Babylon. Wow, he's top dog. I mean, he was really a field lieutenant for Nebuchadnezzar. He was managing the whole city of Babylon and had full control of, as we see here, the wise men, and most likely probably included the astrologers and many of the magicians of Babylon, that Daniel himself controlled all those guys and had the say-so over them. And look at Daniel, as we know, he requested the king and set Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon, but Daniel sat at the gate of the king. So he then deferred or delegated responsibilities to his three buddies, that they would be the operators, the field lieutenants of Daniel, while Daniel took care of business at the side of the king, Nebuchadnezzar. So here Daniel, I mean, he's sitting at the top. So Belshazzar, you're giving me the third position? I don't think so. And he says so. Look at this. Look how he addresses the king in verse 17. So now Daniel answers, verse 17. You got to get into the drama of this. I don't know about you, but I like to get into the drama and draw it out and put myself in the timeline and begin to, be the bug on the wall, so to speak, to try to get into the emotion, get into the passion, get into the situation of the story. And when you think about how Daniel, I mean, you talk about the confidence of Daniel and what he's about to do and say and talk to the king this way, it's amazing, because Daniel answers in verse 17, he says this before the king. Let your gifts be to yourself. Give your rewards to another. Look, you keep your gifts. I don't need any reward. And yet I'm going to read you the writing. You can keep your reward. I don't want anything. But you know what? I'm still going to tell you what that means. I mean, he's not fooling around here. And he says, but I'm going to read the writing unto the king and make known to him the interpretation. O you king, the most high God. And now Daniel is going to give him a history lesson. Daniel is about to kind of roll back a little bit and give him the backstory of his granddad and why old Nebuchadnezzar ended up as an animal for 7 years and why old Nebuchadnezzar seemed to always be in trouble and what happened to him being the result of what here we see Belshazzar suffering from the same malady. He goes on here and he says, O King Most High, God gave Nebuchadnezzar, your father or grandfather, a kingdom and majesty and glory and honor. And for the majesty that he gave him, all people, nations, and languages trembled and feared before Nebuchadnezzar, before old Nebuchadnezzar, whom would he slew, and whom he kept alive. That is Nebuchadnezzar. In other words, Nebuchadnezzar ruled the roost. If he wanted you dead, you were dead. If he wanted you alive, you lived. Nebuchadnezzar had the rule of law, of life and death in the palm of his hands. He was the utmost, what you could say, dictator and autocrat of the time, and essentially ruled the roost with power. So he says here, and whom he would set up, whom he'd put down. And when his heart was lifted up, and his mind hardened in pride, when he dealt proudly, he was deposed. He was basically made to come down from his kingly throne, and they took his glory from him. And this is another reason why I do believe Nebuchadnezzar was indeed the one who was reduced to an animal, because Daniel's telling the story here. And Daniel's telling the story in context of the fact that Nebuchadnezzar was indeed the target of that devolvement into that event that we read about in chapter 4. It wasn't the grandson there, or the son-in-law, Nabonidus. It wasn't him at all. But at any rate, we go on here, and we read this. But when his heart was lifted, verse 20, up, and his mind hardened in pride, he was deposed from his kingly throne, and they took his glory from him. And he was driven from the sons of men, and his heart was made like the beasts. And here is an obvious statement Daniel's making as a witness to the fact that Nebuchadnezzar experienced that event. And his dwelling was made with the wild asses. They fed him with grass like oxen. His body was wet with the dew of heaven, till he knew that the Most High ruled in the kingdom of men, and that he appoints over it whomsoever he will. So this is the history lesson. Daniel opens this up. He revisits this whole reason for Nebuchadnezzar's demise and the reason for the kingdom of Babylon to be taken from him for 7 years. And as a result, the story is his pride, his ego, the fact that he put himself above God. Well, Belshazzar, what are you doing? Verse 1 through 4, taking the vessels of the temple and marring them in such a way, desecrating them in such fashion, so disrespectfully. I mean, that itself, verses 1 through 4 of chapter 5, are illustrations of his disrespect of the God of Israel, and of course the living God, the only God, because all the other gods, Marduk or Sin, the moon god of Babylon, and others that were at the time heathen gods and considered to be pagan gods of brass and gold and silver, I mean, they weren't gods. They weren't gods at all. They were just idols and out of the imagination of men. The only true God, the only real God, was the God that Belshazzar was insulting by virtue of desecrating his vessels of gold that were taken from the temple as booty from Nebuchadnezzar. So at any rate, verse 22, the story continues. So Daniel continues his rant here and basically dialogue with Belshazzar, and now he's going to direct his comments to him. Man, can you just imagine how Daniel felt in this? I mean, he's talking to this king could have his head off in a minute if he wanted to. You know, I don't like what you're telling me. Off with his head, you know, because He's standing up to the king here. And you, his son, verse 22, O Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, though you knew all this. Wow. Who are you kidding, Belshazzar? You knew this about Nebuchadnezzar. You're doing what you're doing, knowing what you're doing. Wow, this is a real indictment against Belshazzar. But have lifted up yourself against the Lord of heaven, and they have brought you the vessels of his house before you, and you and your lords, your wives, your concubines have drunk wine in them. And you praise the gods of silver and gold, brass, iron, wood and stone, which see not, nor hear, nor know. And this goes to my point that I'm saying about the fact that Belshazzar had no respect for the God of Israel, who is the only God, who is the living God, who is the God of gods, small g. So the bottom line is what Daniel's reiterating here and essentially laying out to Belshazzar is that, look, all of your, so to speak, alleged gods are not gods. They're not gods. And so all of this stuff that you're doing is, for all intents and purposes, quite frankly, insulting. He goes on here, which see not, nor hear, nor know, and the God in whose hand your breath is, and whose all your ways have you glorified, you have not glorified. So he's saying that, and the real God, where your breath is in his hands, you've not glorified him. You've insulted him. You've basically embarrassed him. You're doing things that are just really, really bad. So verse 24, then was the part of the hand sent from him. So here's the first clue, Belshazzar. The hand you saw was the hand sent from God. And it said something to you. It says here, then was the part of the hand sent from him. And this writing was written. And this is the writing that was written. Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. All the astrologers, all the wise men could not interpret that terminology. They had no idea what that meant. Daniel comes in, he looks at it, he sees it, the candle's lit, the wall is lit up, he reads it, and he says the following. Here's the interpretation, verse 26, of the thing. Mene, God has numbered the kingdom and finished it. Tekel, you're weighed in the balances, you're found wanting. Peres, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Now, I don't know what was going through Belshazzar's mind, but he does something here that's really funny. Well, maybe it's not funny. Maybe it's just curious as to when Daniel read that, how he took that. Because he obviously didn't think it was going to be coming immediately. Why do I say that? Because look at the next verse here. Then commanded Belshazzar, clothe Daniel with scarlet, put a chain of gold about it. Now, Daniel said he didn't want this stuff. Daniel said he didn't want it, but the king, he's insisting Daniel's going to get it. So he says, clothe him in scarlet, put a chain of gold about his neck, and he made a proclamation concerning him, that he should be the third ruler. He was dead determined to give somebody that third position. So he's going to give Daniel this third position. In that night, that very night, I don't know how fast he got those words out of his mouth, but in that very night, Belshazzar, the king of the Chaldeans, was slain. And Darius, not Cyrus, interesting, Cyrus was a Persian. Darius was a Mede. It's important you recognize that as we go forward into the book. It's a bit of a nuance, but nevertheless it adds some semblance of sense to why the distinction and how the two play into this event and into this scenario here. But it says here, Darius the Median took the kingdom being about 62 years old. So at this time, Darius was 62 years old. Belshazzar, I don't know how old he was. As I say, I think In some respects, he was, for all intents and purposes, a youngster, comparably speaking. 20s, 30s, I'm not sure, but I haven't been able to find out anything that was worth saying in terms of his approximate age. I wanted, though, at this point, rather than go into chapter 6, just lay down some groundwork as we go forward to bring to your attention some things. You may want to look into this on your own a little bit, but I do want to bring your attention to the fact that chapter 6 starts out with, "It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 princes, which should be over the whole kingdom." So Darius takes charge upon his conquering of Babylon and moves into a certain mode of operation, MO. However, I want you to notice also chapter 7. "In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon." What? Belshazzar's dead. What? Belshazzar's dead. He died over there in chapter 5. We're not in sequence. You've got inset chapters here. And the way the book is aligned and put together is for the purpose of story flow, and much of these first chapters are illustrative of what went on in Babylon leading up to a bunch of visions that were targeted for Israel that came at different times during the rulership of Darius, Belshazzar, and Cyrus. So it's kind of mixed up a little bit, but primarily for the reason of being able to keep the story flow of the content of those chapters in line with what was going on. So it's easier to understand these prophecies as we begin to get into chapter 7. Chapter 8, chapter 9, these are going to be heavy chapters as we begin to get into that. But the point of it is, I want to just bring your attention, in the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon. But as I mentioned, this only illustrates chapter 7, let's use the term inset. It's an inset chapter. It's an inset chapter, which then means that chapter 6 is an inset chapter. Because chapter 6, according to chapter 7, hasn't happened yet. You with me? So then you go to chapter 8. "In the third year of the reign of Belshazzar." Oh, so we've got year 1 of Belshazzar, and we got year 3 of Belshazzar, and then of course we have the downfall of Belshazzar. You see what I'm saying? So beware, I'm just laying some groundwork here as we look out toward these chapters that we're going to be getting into. So chapter 8 is also inset. It's not in time sequence. It's not in the time sequence. Chapter 9, look at this. Okay, now we're back after the fall, after the death, after the meeny, tekel, writing on the wall. We're after that now. Here we are. Chapter 9, first year of Darius. So now it's Darius is in charge of Babylon, chapter 6. Remember that? Go back to chapter 6, real quick. Chapter 6. "It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 princes." Okay, so he's in charge now, chapter 6. Flip over to chapter 9. "In the first year of Darius." Okay, so here's the sequence. Now we're going into sequence. Chapter 10. "In the third year of Cyrus, king of," not the Medes, "king of Persia." King of Persia. Darius, Cyrus, king of Persia, king of the Medes. Darius, king of the Medes. So you have this distinction, demarcation, but nevertheless working cooperatively, because Cyrus does get the credit, by the way. Cyrus does get the credit for releasing the Jews back to their homeland. Also in the first year of Darius the Mede, chapter 11. So chapter 6, 9, and 11 are all sequenced in the same first year of Darius. That's when Daniel received these visions. And keep in mind, Daniel 9 and 11 are prophetic in terms of Israel, and the end times. Daniel 11, as some have said, is the longest prophecy in your Bible. I take issue with that. I believe that Revelation, the whole book of Revelation, is the longest prophecy in your Bible. But single prophecy in a timeline, Daniel 11, is one of the longest, if not the longest, prophecy in your Bible in that regard. So as we begin to move into these, I don't want you to get confused over why are we all over the place, because when we get to chapter 7, obviously the recognition of the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, we're thinking, well, now wait a minute, he died over there in chapter 5. How can he be alive in chapter 7? Well, because that we're not interested in that necessary sequence. What we're interested in is what is the content of the chapter, because that's the message. That's the message. That's the more important message. What's going on with the chapter? And chapter 7, of course, as many of us know, is a vision that Daniel received, Daniel had, not Belshazzar, but Daniel had, that actually brought to mind the four beasts. Remember? The lion, the bear, the leopard, and so forth, and the 7 heads, and what have you, and then the 4th kingdom and the 10 kings and all that goes on in chapter 7 that hooks up with and links with Revelation chapters 13, 17, and roughly 15 and 14 as well, in many respects. So it begins to expand out. I want to take this slow so that we can take it step by step and begin to see how this builds, because there's a lot of interplay between these coming chapters that we're going to see. Now, chapter 6 is all about the lion's den and what goes on with Daniel in his introduction to the Mede and Persian kingdom, because right out of the bat we see in chapter 6, and it's kind of like a backstory. So we're going to be given this little insight about Daniel's life with the new head of household, the Medes and the Persians, who took the Babylonians out. And so now Daniel gets his introduction to the Medes and the Persians, and we find out Daniel's not very well liked. As a matter of fact, as we go through chapter 6, and hopefully you'll read it before we go back to it next month when we have the Bible study on chapter 6, you're going to see that Daniel goes through a lot of drama and ends up in a lion's den. And these guys they want him dead. There's a conspiracy basically to take Daniel out by, as you would say, the deep state. They want him out. They don't want him to be alive because they were jealous of him, frankly. They were just jealous. He had this gift of being able to interpret dreams and be able to have the ability to be given these insights, and consequently the kings were looking to him for answers, and in fact they weren't. So we're going to see a lot of that play out in chapter 6, and then in chapter 7 we're going to go back to Babylon. You with me? So we're going to go back to Babylon, and it's going to fill in some additional things in chapter 7 of what happened to Daniel while Belshazzar was still alive and Babylon was still going on, because what's important is not the time sequence of when chapter 7 happened. What's important is what chapter 7 is about. The fact that Daniel received it when he was in Babylonian captivity is immaterial. The fact of it is, what's really important is what did he receive. And that is, of course, as we understand the story of the 4 different beasts, the lion, the bear, the leopard, and the 4th beast that was so dreadful and terrible. So we'll get into that, and we'll proceed along those lines, because as we proceed into the ensuing chapters here of 7, 8, 9, 10, and 11, these are very heavily painted prophetic chapters. A little bit of history is salt and peppered through them, but very, very prophetic, very relative to our day and age, and the voice of Daniel, frankly, should be heard today, especially in light of what we're all seeing beginning to manifest more clearly in our politics, in our geopolitics, and in the landscape of the world's interrelationships of what is going on. So, was not a long Bible study, but got through chapter 6 here faster than I realized. But at any rate, any questions? Anybody? Yeah, Dave?
It doesn't say who killed Belshazzar, does it? Was it the Medes?
It was the Medes, yeah. Darius, his army, the way I understood in studying what I was studying from the information that is registered with Cyrus's cylinder and Nabonidus' prayer that was found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. There's a lot of archaeological recordings of what went on and how it came down. And the Babylonians were good record keepers in some respects. And as I mentioned in passing, Nabonidus, who was coming out of Tameh, the city of Tameh, where he was at for about 10 years, I guess what motivated him, compelled him to get back to Babylon was the rumors and of course the news that he was getting from writers, I'm sure, and people telling him that Babylon was under threat and the Medes and the Persians were making moves toward invading Babylon. And so consequently, he mobilized his men there in Tameh and came down to meet the Medes and the Persians, of which the Medes and the Persians, beat him up. And for all intents and purposes, didn't stop. They kept... No, they didn't. No, if I remember correctly, they didn't. No, they didn't kill him, but they did beat him up and stopped his army from stopping them. And they continued to pursue, the Medes and the Persians continued to pursue Babylon. And the material that I read also did not necessarily illustrate the fact that the army he attacked was the same army that Darius was leading. So there could have been two groups, so to speak. One was led by one group of Medes and Persians and another of the Medes and Persians. There could have been, different cavalries, if you want, for lack of a better term, that were all in this attack mode. And the one that Nabonidus attacked wasn't necessarily the one that was really going to hit Babylon, or maybe didn't hit it on the same flank, and Darius was on another flank. Medes and Persians were allies until later on when Cyrus then began to become Cyrus the Great, and he took over the whole kit and caboodle, as they say. Yeah. Any other questions? I found it interesting, though, that word father is not necessarily, meaning father. I mean, with all the historical, archaeological records, it's very realistic to consider that Nabonidus was the son-in-law of Nebuchadnezzar, he married the daughter of Nebuchadnezzar, Nitocris, and Nitocris had Belshazzar. And Belshazzar was the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar. All these names. But it really is an interesting play of things. And there's a lot of history to it, and certainly I think the overriding message of this is that God is in and working in the affairs of humankind. And Belshazzar had to learn that very lesson that Nebuchadnezzar had to learn, that God puts kings in place. God places leaders of nations in their roles, or allows for them to be in those areas and roles. And Belshazzar and Nebuchadnezzar are illustrations of the fact that these two guys, being the egocentrics that they were and the scoundrels that they were, just didn't get that message in that regard, in that respect. So I think it's important for all of us to respect the realm of God's operation and His ability to intervene when providentialness, if I can use that term, is necessary to direct and guide His story. Because as I've said, this is a predetermined, pre-written script. It is, as I've often said, God has painted Himself into a corner predicated on the prophecies that are written. And so unless mankind, this is the only condition that can erase this stuff, and that would be if mankind would repent wholesale, globally, worldwide, everybody, and accept Christ as their personal Savior. Well, I wouldn't hold your breath on that one. So the reality of it is that unless that would happen, and it won't, well, guess what we're faced with? We're faced with the script. And the script doesn't play out well for us as human beings are concerned. We've got a lot of pain and suffering and agony, destruction, and wars ahead of us. As I've said before, there are 3 sets of 7 in the book of Revelation. There's 7 seals, the 7 trumpets, and the 7 plagues. However, taking that one step further, there are 4 wars in Revelation. There are 4 wars. Revelation chapter 6, verse 8, that's one, where 25% of mankind dies. Then in Revelation 9, there are 2. And of course, the fourth one is Armageddon, with Jesus' return. So in that Revelation 9, 1/3 of mankind, of the remaining 3/4 that died in Revelation 6:8, are killed, which leaves about half of the planet is going to be destroyed right off the bat of those three wars. So we got a lot of stuff ahead of us yet, and when it breaks and how it breaks remains to be seen. But needless to say, we need to be busy doing God's work and making sure that we're doing the best we can in our Christian lives to stay strong and stay healthy Christians for God's sake and His glory and the continuing preaching of this gospel. So, yeah, that's important for all of us and for God too, to see us in our lives to do those things that are right and proper. Any other questions? Statements? Anybody want to make a comment? What?
It says in the valley where the war happens, that the blood will be as high as the flankers of the horses. Is that a metaphor, or is that going to actually be that much blood?
Yeah, it depends on how you determine it. You can take it literally. That's a lot of blood. That's a lot of blood. Yeah.
That's a big valley.
Yeah. Take it metaphorically or symbolically. The point of it is it's a lot of death. A lot of death. So, some people take it literally and claim that it's going to be blood up to the horses' bridles. Whether it is or not, the fact of it is it illustrates a lot of killing, a lot of death, a lot of destruction that's going to happen in that valley of Megiddo. And needless to say, it's not going to be very, very pretty, to see that. Whether it's up to their bridles or up to their knees, that's a lot of blood. A lot of blood. So main thing is that it is a war, and people are going to be killed, and it is a battle that God's going to fight at the end there. Anything else? All right. Well, onward to chapter 6. Just making sure. Okay. See you the next time.